Welcome back people to another video, and another video of me driving in reality. So in the last video we checked out my final qualifying of the year compared with F1 World Champ Jenson Button. That was when I was extremely confident in the car, having almost a full season of racing under my belt. However, this video is the complete opposite. We're going to look at my first session of the British GT campaign from 2020, the second time I ever drove the car, and it was the first time I drove it on British soil at a racetrack called Oulton Park. Okay then, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay then, so I'm being pushed back by the mechanics, and you can see I'm starting the engine, trying to pull away nice and slowly. Really don't want to stall it at this point because there's nothing more embarrassing than, stalling it on the first time out. Luckily we don't, we get away quite nicely in the pits, pit speed limiter on, and I'm just composing myself really, ready to drive the car for the first time since pre-lockdown. So this was after the first lockdown in the UK, because of obviously Corona, and this was 4 months later to the Paul Ricard test, which you can see in the card above was my first ever time in the car. So in this clip I am very rusty, I think that's probably safe to say. I'm getting used to all the systems again, let alone the driving of the car, the track. Never driven this track before, obviously in the simulator I have, but never driven this track in real life. The car, still not very used to it at all. It's been 4 months since I've driven it. And there's loads of systems that you have to do and get used to. You need to check for alarms if there's any issues with the car, because it's my first time in the car, but it's also the car's first time rolling out onto the track. So there's kind of a balance of, you got to focus on yourself, but you also need to focus on the car. And so my general approach when driving a real race car at this point for this session, but in general, is try and always be in control when you're learning the ropes. So I'm obviously learning the track. It's a completely new situation to me, and to be honest, every time you step in a real race car, it usually is, unless you're really experienced. So I'm always building up to it progressively with as little risk as possible, because it's so catastrophic when you get it wrong. It could be a career ender, and especially for me at this stage, game of going to racing driver type thing. If I stick it in the barrier in the first session on the outlap, for example, then it might not be a career ender, but it's definitely not the best way to start. And to survive in motorsport, you've got to be exceptional. I said that in a previous video, and that is not very exceptional, putting it in the barrier. But for example, when I say as little risk as possible, obviously it's a very risky situation anyway, because it's so easy to throw it off, especially when you're doing the speeds that a GT3 does around a track like Oulton Park as well, where there's no runoff. So the approach I had, or I got kind of told a little trick, was if I wanted to experiment with a corner and brake later, what they said to do, my driver coach, was instead of braking later physically on the track, brake at the same point you were braking before, brake harder. And if you're braking too early for the corner, so it's quite obvious to a driver when you're braking too early, you get to the apex at too narrow an angle, then the lap after that you can brake later without having the risk of going straight off because you've braked too late. In theory you should be alright. If you put the same brake pressure on you put on that previous lap, it's a risk-free way of doing it, whereas on the simulator you wouldn't do that. You just brake later. If you end up on the grass or in the barrier, you learn from it, you press escape, you restart and you go again. So you can see clearly everywhere I'm short shifting, I'm not making the most of the engine, and it's just because I'm getting used to the speed again. It took me 1 or 2 laps just to kind of get my bearings in general. It's not normal for myself or anyone, I think, unless you're racing every week, to feel used to that kind of speed, because on the motorway or whatever you're not doing anywhere near that speed. So it's the acceleration, the braking, everything is completely alien, especially with lockdown. You're sat on your sofa for weeks on weeks and months, and then you jump into this. It's a bit of a shock to the system. But you can see with every lap we're building up more and more confidence. We're taking a bit more apex speed, braking a bit later everywhere, starting to make the most of the engine by shifting later. So to be honest, because it's the first session, I wasn't changing ABS settings, TC settings. I was barely focusing on how the setup felt. It was purely about acclimatising to the track and the car. And then after that, when I was acclimatised, I can start looking at those finer details. And so in terms of the sim prep I did for this particular weekend, I used a normal set of Corsa. I trained for it using VR, which did really help. The track wasn't laser scan because on a set of Corsa Competizione, the British GT pack isn't out yet, so I had to find a kind of B-Tech mod, and it was okay. The car was pretty good. The mod of the car, again, not fully realistic like a set of Corsa Competizione, but it was good enough. So when I got to the track, and in this session on Friday, I knew pretty much where I was going, obviously, but reference points, braking points, gears to use, because the gear ratios in the game in theory are the same as the car. We made sure of that before the season started. I checked with the engineer and that correlated, so I kind of had a bit of a head start. And you know, undoubtedly some of the drivers on this grid wouldn't have done that. I know that they wouldn't have trained on the sim. I think that is a disadvantage because the sims these days are getting more and more close to real life. But anyway, you can see we're approaching a GT4 McLaren, a bit of traffic, a new situation for us because we haven't had this situation before. At the Paul Ricard test I told you about, they were all GT3s, and to be honest, most of them were quicker than us because it was my first time in the car. This, on a track this narrow, I remember it quite vividly actually. This was quite a big moment, my first overtake, shall we say, of real racing at this level. And so in my mind, once I go past this McLaren on the left, in my mind I've got to keep an eye on my self-improvement, and that is kind of my priority at this point. But I need to focus on the car setup, how it feels, if there's any issues, because after every session we have a little debrief and you need to feed back accurate, trustworthy but kind of good information to the engineers and also Michael, my teammate, because if they can't trust me from day one, then it would be quite hard to try and get their trust back. So I was focusing a little bit on that. My mental capacity at this point was very strained. I do remember feeling a little bit overwhelmed, but as the season went on, more experience, getting more used to it. Like anything, your mental capacity gets freed up a bit, and so on and so forth. So approaching Island Bend, the long left-hander, you'll see, if we look into the setup of the car very briefly, I mean, we don't actually see it in this corner because we're not going fast enough near the limit, but you'll see I'm putting a load of steering lock on pretty much in every corner, which is not normal. At the time I wasn't really thinking about that, I thought it was completely normal. But if you go and watch my last qualifying lap compared with Jenson Button in the card above, you'll see that we're not putting anywhere near as much lock on in that video compared with this one. So the setup of the car was a lot different here at Oulton Park. It was a new car for the team. We had that run at Paul Ricard, but that was kind of it. So to develop the car setup, it takes time, it takes running, it takes kind of mistakes to be made, to learn from the mistakes. So it was very understeery, and that was costing us quite a lot of lap time. And you can see, especially in this next right-hander, Druids, the fast right, we put a lot of lock on and we're waiting for the front end to bite. Again, we're not really near the limit at this point, but there is a little bit of understeer there, and as we get faster throughout the weekend, that understeer gets even worse. So by the end of the weekend we ended at a pretty good point where there wasn't that much understeer, we were quick, maybe a little bit of understeer still there, so there was something to improve on, which is always quite important at the end of the weekend. But you can see as well the brake pressure, we're nowhere near hitting the pedal hard enough. And looking back at the data for this session, I was only hitting 70 bar of brake pressure, I think once or twice. The rest of it was a little bit lower. And at Silverstone in my last quali, it was 110 in certain corners. So we are way underneath where we need to be in braking. Again, just from not being used to it. My legs were clearly strong enough because in qualifying at Oulton Park and in the race I was hitting 100 bar, 95 bar, something like that, so it was just me being a bit of a wuss to be honest. The track is green, that's another factor as well. Start of the weekend, there's been no running at Oulton Park for a long time, so the track will be not very rubbered in, quite slippery. It's easier to throw it off when that's the case. Obviously, you know, on a sim, if it's optimum track relative to a green track, it does feel a hell of a lot different. And so at the same time as all of this, as we approach a Supra GT4, which, yeah, another little task ahead of us, we want to be on par with Michael O'Brien, my teammate. So obviously Michael had experience in GT4, he's new to GT3, so I was aware and made aware of it before the season that my main target was to be on his pace and, if I can, better it, because he's a great benchmark. We knew that before the season, and as I said earlier, to be exceptional you need to hit the ground running. So I'm looking, luckily this wasn't the first time the car went out. Michael went out in the car 2 or 3 runs before me, so I had a delta on my screen. Unfortunately the lap timer in this session wasn't working because, again, the car hadn't done much running, there's a few teething issues, and I was doing my best to beat it, because if you beat it or you're already at the same pace from the get-go, it shows to the team that you're at a decent level. And because I was a gamer, a lot of people don't initially expect that. So yeah, very important for me to obviously learn as much as possible and feel comfortable and whatever, but the main thing was to be quick. And luckily, I can't remember specifically, but I think we were on a very similar pace from the get-go. So it was a good way to start the weekend, start the season. I can improve on that. I knew after the session, when I come in a minute, there was a lot to improve on. But at the same time, there's so many emotions going through your body and your brain. Like, you're enjoying it, you've got so much adrenaline. Like, I know it doesn't look particularly fast on the onboard, but it felt so fast, especially around a track this small, which obviously pumps a lot of adrenaline around. And so I believe we've got the end of this lap and then the start of or the whole of next lap, and then we're boxing. So at this point, I'm fully in the groove. I am trying to still experiment. I'm not really thinking about coming in, but you'll see at the end of the next lap I do. So around halfway round the next lap, they call me into box, and then my mindset completely changes from learning about driving and focusing on driving to thinking about the pit stop. How am I going to enter the pit safely but really fast at the same time? So if I take you through my last lap, I've had 4 laps in the car now. This is my 5th lap. I'm braking quite early, to be honest. Just getting used to that kind of bumpy entry of turn 1 and trying to keep it within track limits as well. But it is practice, so if I do run wide or I do run onto the grass a little bit, those testing the limit things are fine. That's what practice is for. The key thing is not to do it in the qualifying or the race. So approaching Ireland, I am getting more confident in the car now, and with a car like a GT3, it's not fully downforce dependent, but downforce does come into it, and when you get confident in high-speed corners, you do find lap time from that. Obviously to a point, you know, you don't want to throw it off, but it does help when you have confidence in the car. So approaching the chicane, this little section I really enjoyed. A little bit of curve on the left, a little bit of curve on the right, get on the power, try and avoid that final curve on the left. And we've got a Ferrari GT3 in front of us, so we're catching him quite nicely, which at this point in my racing career was, you know, not being overtaken by GT4s or falling behind GT3s massive amounts. That would have been not a great start, but luckily we were fairly on pace. I don't exactly remember where we were in the times. I think we were mid-table, but there were so many factors still coming into play in the weekend, you know, who had what fuel, who was running what tyre set, etc, etc. So at this point we've been told to box, so my mindset has completely changed. I'm thinking about how am I going to enter the pits as quickly as possible but as safe as possible, all the procedures, hit the pit speed limiter button, and then on the dash in front of me it should turn to green, and then I know I'm safe to not go over the limit. So I've hit the pit speed limiter, I think, now, and then I've slowed it down very, very cautiously, to be fair. 50 kilometers an hour is the speed limit, so we have loads of time in the pit lane entry, but we can sort that out later in the weekend. And then our turn-in was a bit early to that board and nice and reserved, really slow, but it's the first session, so if you do it slowly to start with, build it up over the course of the weekend, then for the race, you should be in a pretty good place. And so there you have it. I got out of the car, I think, after that session, then went in for another 5-lap run, and then that was that session done. Moved on to the afternoon session after a debrief, and then we were into the race weekend. So you really have to learn fast, you have to do it safely. I think that general approach continued throughout the weekend from myself, obviously going into finer details to try and gain those smaller amounts of lap time, whilst not firing off into the barrier, of course, because that wouldn't be ideal. Despite the fact I think I have more experience now, I think it's always smart to approach driving a real race car the same, and that's with respect, because you don't have to be afraid, you just need to respect it. As soon as you don't, I think you will potentially end up in the barrier, because, not that I have yet, I can see it going wrong though if you have the wrong mindset and wrong approach getting into the car. And then after that, it's a bit of a snowball effect. So when you get a little bit of confidence, you get a bit more optimistic, you try things, it works, you end up maybe having a bit of success, and then it just goes round and round and round, and then until, you know, you go off or whatever, you're always on the up, which is really good. But that is the end of the video, people. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe found it slightly interesting. Give it a like if you did, sub up if you loved it, but until the next video, I'll see you soon.